Good afternoon, Grace family. Happy to be here with you, getting ready to read some of Colossians. We're in Colossians. We're going to be looking at Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 18. And if you remember on Friday, if you were able to tune in, we talked about the individual kind of rules based on the theology that Paul had presented in the first two chapters of Colossians. As he gets into chapter 3, he begins talking about what are the implications of the theology that he has shared. And so in chapter 3, verses 1 to 17, there is an individual as it exists and participates within the church, what that looks like. And that's what we saw specifically in verses 1 through 17. At verse 18, Paul transitions from the interactions among believers with each other individually, which was what we specifically saw above, specifically in this section here, which I'm just going to go ahead and take a look at real fast, which is putting on the new self, right? That's kind of that whole section here. And so he goes from that to what we see in verse 18, which is all the things that he asks us to put on and put off, to rules for households. And this is kind of a change. So it goes from how do you handle each other individually as a corporate whole, and then more specifically, how do you work together with each other in households. And so we're going to be looking at verse 18 to chapter 4, verse 1. Really, that's kind of the section. Chapter divisions, I don't think did a good job here. There's some reasons why they did it the way they did it, but we're not going to get into that. But verse 18, so I'm going to read verse 18 to chapter 4, verse 1. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord, and husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by ways of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. So Paul starts off the address from individual commands that are common to everyone, in relation to everyone. From there, Paul's going to begin focusing on the specific areas of household relationships, which includes wives and husbands, children and parents, and slaves and masters. And so this is a very consistent pattern that we see throughout the scriptures, and we see this also in Ephesians. So Ephesians talks about the relationships between each other, ultimately with verse 21 concluding with submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he goes into household relationships, wives and husbands. He does quite a bit lengthier. We're going to take a look at that in a second. And then he talks about children and parents, and he talks about bondservants and masters. And so it's a consistent pattern. We see it there. And then I'm going to go back up to where we were here. Hold on 2 seconds. Come back up. And then you'll notice here, 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. So right after he deals with the corporate whole in 2 Peter chapter 2, he then goes into 2 Peter chapter 3, wives and husbands. Right after wives and husbands, he deals with specifically suffering generally for righteousness' sake. And he'll actually go into slaves and masters there shortly thereafterwards. And so we see this as a consistent pattern in the New Testament, that they would address specifically these things in this manner. Some specific observations from Colossians. We start off right off the bat with Paul addressing wives. And so it says, wives, submit to your husbands, be subject to them. The word specifically here in being submitting, or I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. Sorry, I didn't bring it up before. Let me do that for you guys now. So just because there's a lot of conversation nowadays to what does this word mean, I just want to give you a lexical definition of the two Greek words that are used. Specifically, the word that we're going to be looking at is hupart, right here. Ason, it's just the word right here. And it's to bring something under firm control of someone, or to be subject to, or to bring under control. Submit, and that's a willful action of the individual to bring yourself into control of somebody else. And that's specifically what we have in this particular scenario. Now, some verses in scriptures oftentimes cause us to pause and maybe even experience a little bit of frustration. We think of all the reasons why, if we were to follow a particular verse, and how we would be adversely affected. And I would be wrong not to recognize that someone listening to this might feel this way specifically about this verse. That you may come to the conclusion that I'm a misogynist and I think very lowly of women. Because I've read this verse, and I'm saying that really and truly this passage clearly teaches women as wives to submit to their husbands and to be subject to them. Now, I think that this is very hard for some people to hear, but the reality is here's what I know, okay? When we submit ourselves to the Word of God, we are blessed for following the pattern that the Lord has established. And that doesn't mean that there are not abuses that come from people misusing the Scriptures. And we should address those misuses, and they happen all the time. And we should address when they do occur, but we shouldn't throw out what God says concerning something because someone misuses it. And in this particular instance, household relationships, people will throw out what God says in Colossians, in Ephesians, in 1 Peter, and in other passages, like 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, because it can be used or abused towards women. And so one thing I think that we have to correct, because society has gotten this wrong, this passage where it translates the word wives, this doesn't mean women in general. And so this passage doesn't teach that women in general need to submit to men. This doesn't mean that women in general have to obey the men in their lives. That's not what this is saying. Some people have articulated that that's what this is saying, but it's not. It's specifically Christian households. And so, in general, women need to submit to whoever God puts as an authority over them, but that's not necessarily going to be a man in their life. In the context of wives and husbands, because of the imagery that's used here in both Ephesians and Colossians, and also in 1 Peter and Timothy, we believe that in the household relationship, God has designed the man to be the head of the household. And we could certainly argue that it's cultural, as many have tried, but Paul uses the image of Christ in the church in Ephesians. We're going to read that in a second. He uses the image of creation in Timothy. And in Peter, he uses both the Genesis order with Abraham and Sarah and also creation, specifically to illustrate the reason why it's a divine appointment that wives would be subject to their husbands. And so verse 18 in Colossians, Paul shortens probably what is written in Ephesians. So I want to take a look at that real quickly with you. Here's what Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 says. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Notice, to your own husbands. My wife is not to submit necessarily to another woman's husband. That's not what this is calling for. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Now, this is an extremely difficult thing for women to do, and I recognize that. In a lot of ways, it's difficult primarily, though, because men have not followed what Paul then says directly afterward for the men to do. In verse 25, let's look at what's required of men. Well, let's not be focused on what's required of women, but let's look what's required of men. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one who ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And see, there is this element here, okay, that husbands, you are to give up everything for your wife. Now, what this means is that whatever you want becomes secondary to whatever she wants. Her priorities are your priorities. Whatever she needs is your priority. Whatever is most important to her is something that you evaluate and you try to meet. And this is the kind of way that a husband would love his wife, give himself up for her, like Christ died, took on the penalty for us. He took on the penalty of the cross, of the death, and he died to himself so that we might be living to him. And so the idea here is that we, as the husbands, are the one to sacrificially love our wives. And we are to give up our desires. And that doesn't mean that you can never go out and do something that you enjoy doing. That's not what this is saying. But this is saying that your wife's needs should come before your desires. What your wife needs should come before what you want. In women, if your husband is putting you first in that way, in the appropriate way, not before Christ, but they're putting you in the sense of that your desires before their own. Why wouldn't it be easy to submit to someone who is caring so gently and so kindly and cherishing you and loving you and caring for your every need and ensuring that if you need something or you desire something, that to the best of their ability, they're supporting you in that. Now, and if they're doing that, that should be something easy to submit to. And it should be easy, again, for the husband to love his wife when his wife is respecting him. And so there's this element to which when the cycle is working properly, each member is working to support the other because you're one flesh. The problem is that we get into cycles of bad and abuse where the husband doesn't love his wife and doesn't care for his wife in a way that is actually caring for her more than himself. And so he abuses her. And then she, in turn, doesn't respect him and doesn't love him, doesn't care for him, doesn't submit to him, because why would she? He's abusing her. And so the problem is sometimes as we talk about correcting one issue, and there are lots of situations we could look at in society today where we focused on maybe one or the other partner, when really both need to be addressed. And that's why counseling is so important for a situation when you have a bad cycle in a marriage. You've got to work together to resolve where those issues are. And that's where I would say, come to counseling, come talk to me, come talk to one of the elders. We'll connect you either with a counselor who can help, or we'll ourselves try to help. But this is kind of the element here in the household relationships. It starts with the husband and the wives. That's where it starts, and then you'll notice it goes even in Ephesians. It goes to children and parents. And so one last thing I want to point out, something that's interesting. I love how 1 Peter 3:7 puts it for husbands. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. Now, this is not talking about them weaker emotionally. This is not talking to them about weaker, that they just can't handle. This is talking about generally men are stronger than women. That's what it's saying, generally. And since they are heirs with you, notice that the women are heirs with the men. They're not second-class citizens. They're just as equal in heirs of the grace of life. And you'll see that when men don't treat their wives in an understanding way, that means trying to understand what they're struggling with, understand what their issues are, live with them in a way that's loving and caring and treating them with gentleness and kindness, your prayers, men, will be hindered. That's what it says. Because if you don't do this, if you don't show honor to your wife, if you don't show her an understanding way of approach. And I'll tell you this, I struggle with sometimes, right? Sometimes that me and Alyssa, we're passing ships. We come at something differently. And if I'm not careful in how I interact with her, and I'm not understanding, and I don't show honor to her, and I don't respect her, and I don't love her and care for her more than my own desires and needs, then my prayers may be hindered. And God is not to be mocked. This is something He's serious about. And so, men, that's what we need to take up that mantle. You want to be the leader. You want to claim leadership. You want to say that, well, my wife is to submit to me. Then be the kind of leader that she can submit to. And wives, look to your husbands. And if they are trying, then work with them. Don't work against them. And so this is the household relationships that's honoring to God. And this is what it should look like when we're functioning properly. And a lot of times, unfortunately, Christian relationships and Christian households are just as messy as the world's, and that's sad. That's really sad. Then the next section, specifically in Colossians, talks about, you'll notice it talks about fathers, don't provoke your children lest they become discouraged. And I'll tell you, parents, it is extremely important that you not discourage your children. That you not provoke them to wrath, as would be said in Ephesians. Certainly, we understand chapter 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. But I think it's easy to focus on that. But the second part of verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Discipline is not punishment. And if you understand discipline and punishment be the same thing, you're missing something. Discipline is you're doing something to someone for their good. Punishment is sometimes punitive in that I want to make you pay. And I think it can be very easy for us as parents to try and make our children pay for what they've done, and kind of pay a restitution to us. And that's one way to provoke your children to anger. Now, another way is to not provide proper space for them to begin making the decision that they need to make. And it's very easy to control children sometimes, and I know that happens in some relationships. And in fact, the parents will continue to control their children in a way that's abusive. And when they do that, you're going to eventually provoke your children to anger and to wrath. And instead, we need to not do that. We need to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And if they leave that, that's on them. But at the very least, we need to be disciplining, which is, for good intent. And we need to be not only telling them why we're disciplining them, but giving them the reasons why this is the right actions. Help gain the instruction of the Lord. What is this to benefit them? Tell them the why. When they ask the why, as many as times as they might ask it, and the millions of times they may ask it, and maybe it's just an excuse, but give them the why. They need to know that. They need the instruction. That's the piece that we must not leave out in our discipline of children. And so I think the scriptures are really clear about that. Then we talk about specifically bondservants and obeying those who are earthly masters. Now, this is something in our current generation that we go, ooh, icky. And some people have even gone as far as to say, well, this is in reference to working relationships. And although I think there's a clear element of when we work for the Lord, and we do all that we do to the glory of God. And specifically, this is in reference to household relationships. This is in reference to employment relationships. This is in reference to people who have sold themselves into a relationship with a particular person, and that they are now owned by that person. And so we don't do that with our employers. Our employers hire us to complete a job which we get paid for, and at any point it can be at will on either side. And so it's an entirely different circumstance. We can't apply everything here to that. But it does say, verse 22, bondservants. So this is people who are in that situation. In everything, those who are your earthly masters, obey them. Not by way of eye service, which you know exactly what that is. That's doing making it look like you're doing the right thing when you're really not. Don't be a people pleaser, but instead by sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. So despite what your master might do, work for the Lord, and knowing that from the Lord you will receive your inheritance as a reward. Ultimately, even if your master is not going to treat you well, even if he's not going to do what you would wish he would do, you're going to receive an inheritance from the Lord. You are serving the Lord Christ. When you serve your master in this way, you're serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer, look at this, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Look, in a world, in Roman culture, where there was partiality everywhere, for the servant to hear, look, there's not going to be any partiality with the Lord, and they will get what's coming to them. And he will be paid back for the wrong he has done. You just do right? You just do right. You control what you can control. And these servants had no control in their life. So the only thing that they could do is to do exactly what Paul's asking them to do here in Colossians. Conversely, verse 1, and there's so much in those verses specifically that actually addresses masters, but Paul really makes it clear in verse 1, masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. You're going to give an account. That you have a master in heaven as well. And how you treat them, think about how God might treat you. And don't neglect that. And if in Ephesians saying something similar, masters, do the same to them and stop threatening, knowing that he who is both their masters and yours is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. Look, the reality is there's no partiality with God. And he's not going to give benefit to the masters as opposed to the servants. He's going to treat them equally, just like what 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 says, that they are heirs with you. We are all together one. There is no partiality with God. We are all before God as equals before his throne, and we will all be judged on the basis of the household relationships that he set up and the way that culture is. But we are responsible for the role that we are called to play today and now as we are heirs of the kingdom. So that is specifically that section dealing with household relationships in Colossians. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. If you have any comments or questions or thoughts, feel free to leave it in the comment section below, or you can certainly send me a message as well if you have some other thoughts. God bless you all. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.